hours. There's more to come. General John Allen is speaking tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for anyone who has missed it. We have hundreds of people signed up, by the way. He is, as I hope you know, the administration's leader of the coalition effort in Iraq and Syria, and he's also still involved in Israel-Palestine negotiations, handling the security issues. A really quite amazing man, and this address of his tomorrow is getting enormous media attention. Well, speaking of media, here they are. As a recovering politician, I know how hard it can be to escape the news cycle. But that's what institutions like the Wilson Center are designed to do, to think beyond today's headlines and shape tomorrow's read. David Rothkopf wrote a scathing column in Foreign Policy magazine the other week, that diagnosed Washington with a bad case of conventional wisdom, the bland leading to the bland. Wince, ouch. It's important to do a little better. So we're going to do our best to combat bland today, looking at events that shook the world this year without picking up much media attention. We all know the marquee headlines, and they're important headlines, and most of these media geniuses have reported on them. ISIL, Ukraine, Israel, Iran, but there are other deserving stories out there, too, waiting to be covered. So I'm going to put mine out first. Loose nukes in Pakistan. No kidding, folks. Pakistan has at least 6 nuclear sites. Warheads are transported in vans. This is publicly reported, and I worry that the Taliban, which is, as everybody knows, sort of kind of supported by ISI, the security service in Pakistan, and is alive and well, and is now making some alliance with ISIL, could get some of that stuff out of Pakistan and use it as tactical nukes, Robin. So maybe not, but there's one that I think at least we should devote a few brain cells to. We have a great collection of journalists with us, all of them former, current, or incoming Wilson scholars. You're not a great journalist unless you are one of those categories. And they are going to dig up what the media missed. Elizabeth B. Miller, there she is, the gorgeous one in the gray, is Deputy Washington Bureau Chief for the New York Times. She used to cover the Pentagon and the White House and spent a lot of her time at the center working on a biography of Condoleezza Rice. Greg Ip, who is right next to Rockstar Robin, is U.S. economics editor for The Economist. He researched financial crises while he was with us as a scholar this spring and single-handedly fixed the U.S. economy because of his work. He will be returning to the Wall Street Journal in a few months, but as he has told me, his remarks are in his role as a worker bee for The Economist. Would you have different remarks if you were somewhere else? He'd have a different accent. Oh, that's what it is. Okay. And joining the center in the next class of public policy scholars, you just made it under the line, is Edward Schumacher Matos, who is NPR's ombudsman. I guess ombudsperson. So he knows a thing or two about what the media does, doesn't, should, or shouldn't do. And finally, also with us is Rockstar Robin. Robin Wright. She had a stellar article in the last issue of The New Yorker. She's had how many articles in The New Yorker in the last year? Several, like 5. And in fact, no, yes. And this time she was reporting from the Turkish-Syrian border. She's been to Iran twice this last year. She wrote an article for Time magazine, or 3 articles, on her time in Iran. And the issue where the first one was printed was the number 7 best-selling. New York Times. Oh, I'm sorry. The number 7th best-selling piece in print in
most read
in the entire year. Oh, that's right. We don't have print anymore. So read it online if you haven't already. Anyway, we're thrilled to host all of you, and we're looking for surprises. Please welcome Robin Wright.
Thank you, Jane, very much. I think we're going to have a slide. No? I guess not.
No, wait, yeah, we are.
well, at some point we're going to have a picture. And this, it's going to be a map of the Middle East that I did for the New York Times Week in Review last year, looking at kind of the future of the Middle East. There it is. And what the future will look like. And that's, I'll play off those remarks. Each of us was asked to comment on one story that we have covered this year, and the one that I've spent a lot of time with was on Iran, where I think we're seeing the glass half full and the glass half empty. Even though we don't have a deal yet, we do have a significant dialogue, and the integrity of the diplomatic process has really been quite surprising, that you have 6 world powers and Iran, and no one's really leaked the details. And that there is an interest for the first time in 35 years in actually bridging that gap. The glass half empty, of course, is we don't know whether the Iranians will really bite the bullet and make the tough decisions that will allow for a nuclear deal. So to the underreported stories, I actually want to begin with what is the most reported story and look at the underreported half of it, and that's Syria. There are 2 wars playing out in Syria, and we spend an awful lot of time looking at the crisis with ISIS, but we're doing almost no examination or exploration of the war that has to do with the government in Damascus. And we are making inroads a little bit with ISIS. I went down to Kobani and got there just in time to see the first bomb go off, right, American airstrike go off in front of me. But what's striking is that we're focusing so much on Kobani, which is a small town. It's about the third the size of my hometown of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we're losing sight of what's the real war, and the real stakes now in terms of territory, and that's Aleppo. It's the largest city in Syria. It is one of the oldest cities in the world. There are still 1 million people out of 4 million who live there who are stranded. The government holds about half the city, the rebels hold the other half, and it's on the verge of being surrounded, encircled basically by the government. That while the outside world is focused on little Kobani and the US airstrikes, Assad has used this moment to drop hundreds of barrel bombs. They've dropped 2,500 bombs in the last 50 days alone. And these are very crude types of bomb that are literally, they're made with water tanks and barrels and heaters, and they're filled with shrapnel and so forth, and they're dropped on populations. They have chlorine in them. Use fertilizer for explosive device. They only cost $200 or $300 compared to the $1.6 million we're spending for each Tomahawk missile. And so at a very cheap price, Assad is making headway. And the danger is that if they surround Aleppo and lose Aleppo, the rebels really don't have much left to fight, and that this is a moment we're going in to try to create a new force, and there's very little territory left to protect. And we could find ourselves in a position where the rebels we want to win, who are fighting both ISIS and the Assad government, have so little territory left that they're not really viable. And in the meantime, half of the Syrian population, again, we're not paying very much attention to it, over half the Syrian population is today either refugees or displaced people inside the country. That's one of the largest humanitarian crises since World War II. And the world doesn't care to the point that the UN has just cut off food supplies to 1.7 million refugees. And they just don't have the money to pay. And this will leave people who don't have jobs without food. And this is calamitous. My second story, underreported story of the year from my part of the world is Libya. There was so much hoopla for 8 months as NATO got involved in challenging Muammar Gaddafi. And the fact is we won that war. And this is in the only country that has the resources to actually pay for and make that democratic transition. It's an oil-rich country with only 6 million people. The only one of the 22 Arab countries that could do it fairly painlessly. But instead, you have the elected government, and the last election was only in June. The government is, if you look at the map of Libya, headquartered in Tripoli, has now fled to eastern Tobruk, which is at the far eastern end, way beyond Benghazi. And in the meantime, Tripoli and Benghazi have new governments, both taken over by militants, Islamists. And the elected government has very few resources to try to regain power. And so we look like, after that enormous investment, that great sense of victory against Muammar Gaddafi, that we are losing Libya. And I think that's an underreported story. My third is a part of the world that I used to spend a lot of time, and that's South Africa. A week ago, we marked the one-year anniversary since the death of Nelson Mandela. And this is a country that's supposed to be the economic engine of the rest of Africa, the political model for the region. Today, the truth is that many blacks are far worse off than they were under apartheid. It's a controversial thing to say, but the sad reality, it's true. You see it in a simple fact like life expectancy, which when Nelson Mandela walked to freedom in 1990 was 64 years. Today, life expectancy in South Africa is 51 years. That's tangible. Unemployment officially is 24% and has not been below 20% in almost 2 decades. Unofficially, the rate of unemployment is some say, as much as 40%. It is the rape and murder capital of the world. Crime is rampant. Instead of Mandela's rainbow nation, South Africa today still resonates with racism. A recent poll found that 47% of whites believe that apartheid was not a crime. And the leaders of the ruling African National Congress have sung songs publicly advocating the murder of whites. President Zuma was acquitted for charges of rape with a young woman. He argued it was consensual sex. He got on national television and denied that he got AIDS. She is HIV positive because he had taken a shower the next day. So South Africa is one I worry about a lot, and the rippling effect across the region. To think big, I think one of the underreported stories is globally the move to the right. And you see that in, again, my part of the world, in Turkey, where Prime Minister, now President Erdogan, has gone from Democrat and a model for the Islamic world to autocrat. He has basically undermined the Constitution, grabbing the powers of the Prime Minister, wants to change the Constitution. He's built himself a palace with over 1,000 rooms, and when that was reported, he came out and said, no, there are over 1,100 rooms, and was proud of the fact. He's thumbed his nose at NATO allies when it comes to dealing with Syria. He said he's not willing to fight ISIS. In fact, when I went down to Kobani, what was so striking was seeing these American warplanes flying hundreds of miles. An F-22 cost $68,000 an hour to fly. And there, right in front of me, were rows of Turkish American-made tanks on one hill and howitzers deployed across the border on another, and they were silent. Erdogan does not want to fight a war that is just against ISIS. He wants it only if we create a buffer zone inside Syria. The same thing has happened in Egypt, and that's a country where revolution has been replaced by repression. There have been, in a massive crackdown by General Sisi, tragically democratically elected, 1,200 demonstrators have been killed. Some 1,400 people have been sentenced to death just since he came to power. 20,000 have been detained officially. Some believe that the number is almost twice that. And as has happened across the region, Egypt most symbolizes the way that moderate Islamists have been replaced by militants. We thought we might be able to do business with some of the moderates. We can't do business with any of the militants. The fifth of my unreported stories is human rights. And it's something we give lip service to, but this is, I think, a really bad time because we're so concerned about security that we're willing to focus on stability rather than democracy and democratic values. And this plays out in a place like Saudi Arabia, which we loathe, condemn, and are outraged by the beheadings of ISIS. But in the last, in August, just 4 months ago, the same month that James Foley, one of our colleagues, was beheaded by ISIS, Saudi Arabia beheaded 19 people in 17 days. And nobody has said anything about it. 8 have been involved in non-violent offensives. Just yesterday, they beheaded another person for smuggling amphetamines into Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has the 3rd highest practice of death penalties in the world. I will turn it over to my colleagues, but those are some germs of thoughts about underreported stories. And I think Edward is next.
Thank you. One thing about being an ombudsman is that you cover so many issues over the course of a year that you have no one particular area that you focus on. But I feel that that I find time and again that instead of a particular subject that I find lacking in the coverage of the news media, it's more a way of framing stories, a way of seeing stories. A little bit what Robin said about it's not that the stories weren't covered, it's that they were incomplete. And I find that happens not just at NPR, but in the general, in the mainstream news media and across the news media in general. And I think the side of the framing that the news media over the last year and really over many years continues to miss is the side that's got to do with values, that has to do with morality, that has to do with senses of national identity, and all of their fundamental impacts on economy and on the politics of a nation. That we get caught up in covering the events, we get caught up in covering the numbers, and now we've become very data conscious, right? Without getting to these touchy-feely things that fundamentally are far more powerful than anything else. And so I think that I especially see this on a couple of issues. I'll be here starting in January working on a project of the economics of immigration. And I think that the immigration story, we know that immigration gets covered every day in the media. And yet I find what we don't see in the media is any kind of a fundamental reporting on the impact of immigration, not on immigrants, but on the country. The economic impact, the cultural impact, and the social impact. And really what really should matter to us more than anything is not what is happening just to immigrants themselves, and that's not to say it's not important, because it's terrifically important. I myself am an immigrant. But what is the impact on the country? At what point, when you have 14% of a nation that's not born here, which is the historic high, compares right to the Ellis Island years, you've got, this is mass immigration now, mass immigration, not just the occasional immigrant who comes. At what point do the costs outweigh the benefits? Is there a tipping point that's good or bad for a country? And as you begin to analyze that, and you begin to saying people, we all support the concept of immigration. Immigration generally is good. Let me say that. Immigration is generally good for the country, right? But is there the right mix of immigrants? If so, what kind? And so as we become more and more concerned with what are universal values, which are the individuals, and in this case specifically the immigrants, we become less and less concerned about national values. And what is best for the United States as a nation, or any other nation receiving great numbers of immigrants? Europe is in the middle of the same issue, actually worse, because they actually have many European countries now have higher levels of immigrants than we do, though we think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants. France, Spain, the UK, Australia, higher than the United States. So where is the tipping point, or is there a tipping point? It's very hard to measure, and it's not even addressed in so much of our coverage. That's one general area. The second one for me is so much we see in the news about Ferguson and on racism and so forth. And it's been, clearly race still matters in America. Clearly it's a major issue. I live in Harlem, and I see the way young black men are victimized by the police and by what in New York was a stop and frisk policy. Clearly there is an issue there. But in all the coverage about Ferguson, what often is, I think, has gone lost is there's a tremendous difference between what we define as racism today and what was racism that most of us know in its virulent forms 50 years ago during the Civil Rights era and earlier. I mean, I know I sound like I've done lots of things, maybe that's a function of age, but I also grew up in the South, so I really know what the Jim Crow era of the South was like. That is not what you have today, clearly. And so in terms of what is happening with race, there is a tremendous generational difference, right? And there is a tremendous different way of framing it, even among blacks or among Hispanics, about what's happening with race in the United States. You know, we all talk about, you know, that the Republicans are condemned to a demographic death because they have not been, because of their stance on immigration, they have not been reaching out to Hispanics. And yet, in this past primary, some 35% of the Hispanics who voted Republican. That tells you something is going on among Hispanics that we're not hearing, right? And the same thing among blacks. You've got so many blacks running on the Republican ticket, running there, and something is going on among blacks, and you especially look at young blacks and how their position. You look at millennials and their attitude towards race, which is that it actually divides not so much, consciousness has much less to do with race and much more to do with education and much more to do with income, class, a word we don't like, but it exists. This is not to say that race is not important. It is important. But if you don't start looking at what's on the changes that are happening, you're kind of missing the bigger picture. On violence, it really bothers me, I know it bothers almost all of us in this room, you know, the way the 24-hour news cycle hammers on violence. We have become a nation of scaredy cats. We are all living in fear of some kind of violence going to happen in our lives, either locally or in the world. And yet, statistically, none of it bears out. We are down to murder levels in the United States equivalent to what they were back during the Korean War years, the glorious 50s. This is nonsense, this concern that we have about violence. But it's driving, you know, this great fascination with everybody having to have guns. You know, this great thing about all this, stand your ground laws. And this great feeling that whatever problem exists in the world today, somehow we have to solve it with our military. We have lost any sense of wisdom and of patience because we're so afraid. No, mothers cannot let their children walk to school anymore. The neighbors call and say that you're a bad parent letting your children walk to school because somewhere in the United States, some child was kidnapped sometime in the last 5 years, but it's been playing on TV again and again and again and again and again. What can we do about that? We all believe in freedom of the press here, but at what point can you begin to say, wait a minute, the media is the problem here, not the violence? So how do you address that and still maintain the kind of freedom of press issues? The least we could do is begin framing stories, right, saying that this is the exception and not the rule, or begin to downplay a lot of the violence. It's just not so important. Yet here in Washington, and I also teach at the Columbia Journalism School, we make a big deal by a website that's been started, and this is supposed to be the new age conquering everything, and young people getting out to do what the mainstream media is not doing, though the evening news is, and that's, you know, this homicide watch giving you this website dealing with every murder that happens in Washington. Well, if you live in a community you want to know about murders, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not important. But it's this fascination with violence that's growing at a time statistically the violence is declining. Well, I could go on and on and on, but I think I'll just let it stop there, Robin. We can come back to those issues later.
Thank you very much. Greg's going to give us a look at the economic issues that have been underreported in the last year.
Thanks, Robin. I feel a bit conflicted to be asked to comment on the most underreported story, because of course I'm a reporter, right? So the next question is, well, why didn't you report it, right? So it's like admitting to malpractice. So I'm probably going to take the coward's way out and talk about a story that I reported, but I think more of my competitors should have as well, and given me credit in the process. And what I'm going to talk about is what is the remarkable improvement in the economy we've had in recent years by the single most important indicator we have, which is the unemployment rate. It's come down from 10%, it's now 5.8% on Friday. We had 321,000 non-farm jobs created. The pace of job growth is not just strong, it's accelerating. Just use some simple extrapolation, the unemployment rate could be 5% a year from now. And that is below what economists consider the normal natural rate of unemployment. In other words, within a year, we could have an economy that is fully back to normal. And yet, opinion polls find that most people think we are still in recession. The fact, if you were to tell the average person that the economy is actually 80% of the way back to full health, they would just look at you like you were nuts. And one of the reasons why is that we've had very steady economic growth since the recovery began in mid-2009, in spite of the fact that we've had these periodic domestic crises, such as on the debt ceiling and in Europe. But that growth has only been a little bit over 2%, which is actually quite disappointing and quite low by both relative to history and relative to what was expected. And because growth has been low, wages have been weak, and because wages have been weak, the average household today is still significantly worse off than they were in 2007, which can explain a lot, including why so many Democrats were turfed out in the recent midterm elections, and why Barack Obama continues to get no credit or political dividend from the improvements that I'm talking about. So we have a bit of a mystery. On the one hand, I'm telling you that the economy is doing great based on the single most important indicator that we have. But on the other hand, I'm telling you it's doing lousy based on this other very important indicator. What can reconcile these two things? And what I think has been the underreported story is that we do not just have a problem in this country of inadequate demand, that is to say of consumers and businesses and government not spending enough. We have a problem of inadequate supply. And what I mean by that is that the problem the United States has, and which you see revealed in these numbers, is an inability to produce more goods and services because we just don't have enough labor and capital to do it. And this, I think, is a bit of a, would surprise most people because they're used to being told that the real problem is that we need more fiscal stimulus or more monetary stimulus. Now, don't get me wrong. I do believe that we still need stimulus. We still are some ways from a fully employed economy. But I think we need to pay a lot more attention to what's been going on the supply side. A simple rule is that how fast an economy can, not how fast it does grow, but how fast it can grow, is a function of two main inputs, capital and labor. Essentially, labor is determined by how many people you have of working age and how fast that labor force grows. And capital is determined by how much companies invest and how innovative they are. And we are falling badly behind on both those things. I have a slide. Okay, so this one will tell you something. Most people would, this is the growth of the US labor force. And you can see in the 1970s, we were growing 2.5% a year. That's the baby boomers all coming in, okay? Now look what's happened for the last decade. Just for the last 3 or 4 years, 0.25% per year. So we have very slow growing labor force. You might know the term the labor force participation rate. This is the proportion of the working age population that's actually either employed or looking for work. And that number was 66% in 2007. Today it's only 63%, which is the lowest number since the 1970s. So essentially, 3% of the population just disappeared. They're not in the workforce any longer. Where'd they go? Well, we think about half of these people just retired because the baby boomers first turned 62 in 2008 and began to get Social Security. Those people are not coming back. That is not something that you can fix with fiscal and monetary policy. There are a lot of different explanations about where the other folks went. But even if we look forward, there's one inexorable, unavoidable fact about the US economy, which is we are getting older and population growth will be lower. There is simply no way that we can grow as fast in the next 10 to 20 years as we historically have because there aren't enough people. There aren't enough people of working age, and families are not having enough children. The fertility rate now is around 1.8, 1.9, which is actually below replacement rate in the United States. On the productivity side, now productivity is kind of like something economists know how to measure but don't really know how to explain. We can't really explain why in the late 1990s suddenly there was this explosion of innovation and productivity leapt ahead at 3 or 4% per year. And for the same reason, we can't really explain why it's doing so badly in the last few years. But I'll throw a few theories out there. One is that when the financial crisis came along, it basically caused companies to really pull back on expansion plans, so there's less capital out there. And we just haven't seen the types of innovations that have the generalized impact on business productivity that we did in the late 1990s. Oh, I know you'll mention the latest social media app that you or your daughter has on her cell phone, but I dare you to find any evidence that's made you or her more productive. In fact, I can find considerable evidence that the opposite is happening. I'm not excluding the possibility that one day these things will revolutionize our lives, but mostly I think they have simply given us better ways to play Angry Birds on the subway instead of reading The Economist, which would make you more productive, or the Wall Street Journal, or the Wall Street Journal, I should say. Yeah. So, why does this matter? It's because, at least from where I sit in Washington, I hear almost no discussion of this. The main talking point on the Democratic side is that we need more stimulus, we need more government spending. The main talking point on the Republican side is that too much government uncertainty is holding companies back from investing. So what would be a more reasonable, how would economists look at this problem? Well, let's start with the easy one, which is the population. How do we get more people to work, okay? Well, one of them would be exactly what Edward is going to be focused on, which is immigration. Now, I'll point out that the president's immigration order, which we were all exercised over, you're writing about the economics of immigration, is that what I've said is that immigration is the quintessential supply side policy. More immigrants raises labor, it spurs more investment, and because so many immigrants start companies, it brings us more innovation. So it is the quintessential supply side policy. Obama's order gives us none of those things. Obama's order deals with the people who are already here and does almost nothing, not nothing, but almost nothing to bring more people in. And I get it, okay? There's legislative constraints on what he can do, but the point is that we've dealt with immigration in a way that doesn't actually catalyze its wonderful supply side properties. Another way we can deal with the lack of workers is to get the people who are here to work longer, okay? We live a lot longer than we used to 10 or 20 years ago, and our work is not nearly as physically debilitating as it once was. So there's a very good argument that people should work past 65, you know, the retirement age that the Prussian generals came up with the first pensions a century ago. Democrats, to the best of my knowledge, will not consider a higher retirement age for Medicare or Social Security. And Republicans, who used to make a big deal of it, suddenly flipped during the midterm, and you had actual Karl Rove financing attack ads on those Democrats who had the temerity to support the Bowles-Simpson deficit reduction proposal because it included a higher retirement age. So essentially both parties do not want to raise the possibility of asking Americans to work longer, even though there are excellent economic and demographic reasons why we should ask them to do that. On productivity, I'll just rattle off a few things. First of all, recognizing that we need to be very humble about what it is that produces good, higher productivity, but a sensible tax system, business tax reform would probably do it. We have a Byzantine and very dysfunctional business tax system. More immigration would help for the reasons I've discussed. More attention to infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't just create demand today, it creates supply tomorrow, because a lot of private investment needs the presence of public infrastructure, whether it's electricity or airports, to work properly. And a light touch on regulation. I mean, I believe that in our pursuit of safety, Edward, that you talked about, our obsession to make our world completely free of risk, we have gone overboard, whether it's in, like, we don't let drones fly, even though the Canadians and the Australians are letting it happen without killing lots of people on aircraft, with respect to the internet, with respect to drugs, so we have perhaps tilted too far in the direction of the precautionary principle in a way that is impairing productivity and innovation in some of the most important sectors of the economy today. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Greg. Elizabeth is going to tackle national security and the underreported stories.
Oh, no, I'm not going to tackle national security.
Oh.
What did you, no.
Then tackle away.
No, I'm now an editor. I'm in the black hole of management at the New York Times. So I edit a lot of different stories now, Brett. I don't just cover the White House and the Pentagon anymore. And so I made the mistake this morning of calling up one of our, I'm going to talk about immigration, climate change, and race very quickly, so we can all get to questions. But I made the mistake this morning of calling up one of our reporters who covers immigration and saying, well, what did we miss this year? She was not happy with my phone call. She was obviously, right? Well, you know, as she told me she got everything. So, but she did. That's Julia Preston. But I think what the press overall missed was, and Julia caught it early, she's very proud of that, was this huge influx across the border starting actually long before we reported it in March and April, of all these unaccompanied kids coming across the border. That was going on for months, and we didn't cover it. Julia is an amazing reporter. She's been covering immigration for a long time. And because she looks at the DHS reports, because she talks to border security, because she talks to the activists, she knew about it firsthand, and she went down there and wrote it. But that's the kind of story where this can be happening, and if you're not there, or if you're there and you're too used to seeing this influx every day, or if you're listening to border security and not really talking to them, you can miss a huge story like that. And I think we did miss it in the beginning. And then I would say the New York Times did a great job covering it. The other story that, I don't want to go on too much about immigration, the other story that I think a lot of the press has, again, I have to make an exception for the New York Times in all these cases because I'm not going to come up here and tell you, we didn't cover this. That's my job to make sure we did. But I think on climate change, I think there has been, and I see this among really well-informed people in Washington and around the country, there has been such an emphasis on the Keystone Pipeline as the big environmental story of the year, where if you talk to our really, really smart environmental reporter, Coral Davenport, who's now in Rio covering the climate change summit, you will, and if you edit and read her stories, as I do, you will see that the much bigger story is the EPA regulations that aren't nearly as sexy or you can't grab onto in the way that you can to the Keystone Pipeline. But that's a much bigger environmental story because those regulations, and I'm sure everybody here knows, but because the EPA is right across the way, that especially in June when the president announced this new reg, which would set a standard for carbon emissions on existing coal-fired power plants across the country. That is huge, and that is basically asking the states to come up with their own formulas, but they have to meet a set target. And over the long term, that will have far more impact on the environment than whether or not the Keystone Pipeline is built. And I think those kind of stories are really hard to cover. You need, for a media organization, you need a dedicated, highly aggressive environmental reporter. A lot of newspapers don't have them anymore as they've cut staff. You need somebody who really understands politics, science, the international community. And so that story, I think, has not gotten the play it should have gotten. I mean, we played it huge. We played it very big this year, and we think the environment's a really big story. So that would be one, and we can talk about why the Keystone Pipeline has gotten so much attention. And the third story, and I'm going to be really quick, is I think Obama and race relations. And I'm saying because it's fresh in my mind, because just yesterday we had a story on the front page that I edited about the conflict the president feels about speaking out on racial divisions in the country in the wake of Ferguson and the grand jury decision in Staten Island. It's a really hard, frustrating story for us to cover. We try as best we can. We just know instinctively, we know sort of also from what Obama has hinted at recently this week, that there's a lot of stuff that's said inside that White House and debates and arguments that we never hear from the president. And it's a very interesting story that I think will probably come out in the memoirs. You know, it's very hard to get at as if you're a daily reporter covering the White House, but just the conflict he feels as the nation's first black president to speak out powerfully on this topic, especially now. He's been very restrained his first 6 years in office, except for, of course, the way he spoke about Trayvon Martin, but also it's a much bigger story now because of the pressure he's feeling from African Americans to speak out. And he just feels very constrained. I can see you're taking furious notes here. It doesn't look good. It's all right.
On that.
I'm just sensitive. We get a lot of mail.
An underreported story at NPR. We promise you.
Right. Anyway, so I just think it's because of the pressure he's under from the African American community, from the activists, and from the other side, and his natural sort of cool, cerebral temperament. I think there's a really rich story there that we just have tried, and we did it. I mean, the reporters, Julie Davis and Mike Shue did a great job yesterday, but it took a lot of work on their part. So that's I won't talk about trade. That's all I will say.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to ask a quick question of each one of them, and then open it up for your questions. So I ask you to be brief on this. Greg, I thought your comments were fascinating. To what degree do those problems also play out in Europe and in Asia?
To a great deal, actually. I think one of the striking things that all the countries in the rich world, actually the developing world as well, have in common is this problem of slowing population growth. Germany's population has been shrinking for the last decade. Japan's population began to shrink in the mid-1990s, right around the same time they entered their first of two lost decades. China's working age population has now begun to shrink. It is the first country that will grow old before it grows rich. The lowest fertility rate in a major metropolitan area is in the city of Shanghai. I think it's 1.4. Korea, one of the fastest aging countries. One of the reasons that we are seeing fewer illegal immigrants from Mexico is because Mexico's fertility rate is now almost down to US levels. So when you look around the world, the fact that population growth is slowing everywhere is a problem all countries are going to have to deal with. It creates problems, first of all, of long-term economic growth. It creates problems of affordability. How do you pay for all the generous benefits and pensions that you've promised to the existing population? And finally, it explains some of the phenomena, the weak demand that we have right now. If an aging country, naturally, the people, when they're working, want to save more money for their retirement. If every country is aging at the same time, you have everybody trying to save and nobody trying to spend, and that can create the problems of inadequate demand globally that we see today.
Thank you. I actually have two questions for Elizabeth. We had a setup question, I'll confess, and my setup question you kind of addressed, but I'd love to hear a little bit more with, was, why has the environmental movement latched on to the Keystone Pipeline as the premier issue when there are so many other things? And secondly, on your comment about race, I think one of the underreported stories until Ferguson this year was an awareness in the American population about the number of blacks who were killed by white cops. And, listening to Jon Stewart the other night, he went through slide after slide after slide after slide of all the blacks who'd been killed by white policemen. And then he turned to his producer and said, what time does Colbert come on? Because the implication was he could go for the whole half hour. Why is it that given, that we kind of missed that story until we had Ferguson?
Well, I'll answer the environmental question first, but because it's a really interesting story about Keystone. The environmental, certain people in the environmental movement made the decision a few years ago that they were going to latch on to Keystone because it was a rallying point. It's a physical. It's so simple. It's a physical thing you can see and envision, and obviously it's disrupting this beautiful forest up in Alberta, and it's cutting across the huge swath across the United States to the Gulf. And so it's something that you can rally around and understand if you're, and kids have done it, I mean, they're in their 20s, but they're, there have been protests outside the White House. It's something to get your teeth into. It's hard to demonstrate against an EPA regulation that is, 15,000 pages long or whatever it is. It's just, this is so much easier as a symbol. And they saw that early. I think John Podesta would, because he's very much against Keystone, would not agree with. He thinks that he would say that Keystone was a really important substantive issue. But the fact is that there's all this debate about, well, if you put the oil from Canada on rail cars, they have accidents. It's more dangerous than a pipeline. It's more so. But I think that's the real reason. And it's been effective for them. They've raised a huge amount of money because of Keystone. Now on race, why haven't we reported that? It was sometime when Ferguson first started blowing up, we looked into, could we get statistics from all over the country? We had a debate was it last summer? Yes, February, I don't remember when. We had a discussion about, was it possible to get these kind of figures from police divisions all over the country, and it's really hard to get them. There's almost, you would have to make, it would take, we could do it, months and months and months of reporting to get a full picture of how many, despite what Jon Stewart was doing, but suitable for the times in terms of accurate statistics and figures, to get a full picture of how many black people have been killed by white police officers around the country. That's a hard number to get. Or also, if we're looking for statistics on just generally police brutality. So it's not like we haven't thought about it. It's just a very hard thing to do.
In this day of media cutbacks, as the New York Times is going through.
No. Even with a team of people, you're talking. We don't have a central clearinghouse for police statistics in this country. They're all local police, right? We don't keep those. So that's. But it's not an excuse. I'm just saying we went through this some time ago.
Great. Edward, why is the press, and Greg mentioned this a little bit, but why is the press not given a lot of focus on the economic issue of immigration? But I also want to put a zinger to you. what's the story that people have called you as an ombudsman or contacted NPR and said, why aren't you covering this? What, or complaining that it's not getting adequate coverage?
In the last couple of months, I've gotten more and more complaints about why aren't we paying attention to white working class men? Why are we not giving more reporting? And our great concern, and we should have a tremendous concern about covering diversity. Why aren't we saying more about the crisis, economic and spiritual crisis that white working class men face? And women are saying this, saying, I have a son, and I'm worried about, the world he's growing up into and concerned for him, both in the schools and in the job market. You have a situation now where, the majority of students in college are women. The majority of most professional schools, with the exception of business school, are women. At the journalism school at Columbia, where I teach, it's 2/3 women, more than 2/3 now. And it goes on and on and on. And so there's a concern. This is not to say that we all know that there's still more to be done in the campus, in the realm for gender equality. I'm not saying there shouldn't be, and of course for racial equality. That's not my point. But my point is, and so suddenly you see this Elizabeth Warren saying the Democratic Party has gone awry, and you see Chuck Schumer, great leftist from New York, progressive, saying, we are not paying enough attention to the middle class whites in the Democratic Party, and that's one reason why we did so badly and why we're going down. And it raises a good issue, and it's some truth if you think about it, and you look at the coverage. That's the question that I'm being hit. But curiously, it's a lot of women now asking the question, and they're saying about my son. The same thing, this whole issue of what's going on in campus and campus sexual assault and everything like that. A great people feeling very uncomfortable with that. You saw the reaction, what happened with the Rolling Stone story. It was, I don't totally believe what everybody's saying about how bad it is on campus for women. There's something wrong here, and I'm concerned about what could happen to my son, or if you're a young man, I'm concerned about what could happen to me, right? And so it's just sort of, the rights of men in this kind of a situation, not just the rights of women. So it's all of this. This is not to say there's not a problem. I'm not saying that there's not an issue. It's just that, do we have the balance that looks at the concern for everyone involved here? So you just asked me what kind of questions I've been getting in the last few months. So I think it's curious. This is from the NPR audience, huh? This is not the Fox audience.
It's our audience.
Right? And I spent a decade at the New York Times.
There
I
are
spent
re- yeah,
and I
your
spent a
listeners
decade
are
at the
our
Wall
readers.
Street Journal. On going back to your immigration issue, and I started actually writing about immigration at the Times, and Julia is a good friend of mine, and she's wonderful. She's an excellent reporter. But on the economics of immigration, there's a tremendous debate about just what the impact is. Economists are very divided, particularly on the wage impact of immigration. I think everything that Greg says is very true about the supply side, but he said that, you notice that he said, we need it for innovation and so forth. Well, the issue then becomes, separating low-skilled immigrants from high-skilled immigrants. There's no doubt about the value of high-skilled immigrants, right, for the economy, for innovation, for entrepreneurialism, no doubt about it. For the jobs they create, the businesses, you look at Silicon Valley, you look at so much is all immigrant-driven. And the research I'm doing here is comparing what happened in the Ellis Island years with what happens today, the two great periods of mass migration, and what its impact on the economy has been in both periods. There's also no doubt that low-skilled immigrants do indeed, they're entrepreneurial, even though if it means opening a taco stand, they're very entrepreneurial. You can argue they're entrepreneurial because they have to be entrepreneurial. They can't get mainstream jobs. So they come with a desire to work, they work very hard, and they contribute to the economy. But you can also argue that they contribute to the taxes you have to pay, in the sense that low-skilled immigrants receive more in services than they pay in taxes. There's a zillion studies on that. They do pay taxes. It's totally wrong to say they don't pay taxes. They do pay taxes. including undocumented immigrants. But they receive more than they pay, and it's just strictly a function of income. Everybody who's, sort of lower middle class and below receives more in government services than they pay in taxes. I mean, it's got nothing to do with being an immigrant. It's got to do with what your income level is. So, there is that cost on the fiscal side. And then on the, the wage side, to what extent do they undermine the wages of other unskilled workers, both African Americans and even previous immigrants who arrived? And so it's a huge debate about what that difference is. And it becomes very complicated, and most reporters walk away from it.
Thank you.
And so, but that's on the wage side. And we can come back to some more questions.
We're a little bit behind schedule, so I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions. So if you raise your hand, identify yourself and your organization. Let's begin over here.
I'm sorry. My name's Scott Bush. I guess it would be sort of an environmental specialist on climate change. I don't have an organization. I have a long background. I say this is absolutely fantastic what you've done today. If Rush Limbaugh were here, this is a tremendous indictment of, let's say, the drive-by media, as he would say. I have a couple questions for you. Oh, first an announcement.
No, let's do questions, please.
Just a question. What are you going to do about it? How do you get the media of this country and the people of this country to focus on what the real issues are? You guys are here, and a lot of you have been or will be here outside of the day-by-day working media. What are you going to do to change it?
Thank you. Who wants to take that? You, the editor.
What we're going to do to change it, how we get people more, get them to pay attention?
Yeah.
Well, we try every day. I mean, so I can tell you the New York Times.
Not successful.
Well, I would beg to differ on that. I mean, I feel we have a bigger readership than we've had in any time in the Times' history because of the website and our international reach. I mean, we have, should I tell, 64 million unique visitors a month to the website. That is extraordinary. We do what, I would argue that we are engaged in extremely serious, meaningful journalism, and the audience has grown digitally, a paid digital audience. I would say we can always do more. As you can hear, I was, bemoaning that we needed to push harder on these certain stories. That's my job every day. And believe me, it's the job of the editors in New York, my bosses. And so I would say, the way we're covered, we have a reporter in Rio, that's not cheap. We have reporters in Iraq and Afghanistan, so I would say we are doing that every day. We can't grab everybody, we can't, so that's the only thing I can tell you. We can attract as many people as we can with our journalism.
I would just add, these are underreported stories. They're not unreported stories. And also, great news organizations like the Times and NPR, the Journal, The Economist, can spare resources to do enterprise reporting. But a lot of the time, what our readers want to know is what's going on in the world today. So if the House of Representatives passes repeated bills to approve Keystone, and others pass repeated bills to stop it, that's going on and needs to be reported on.
Yeah, I would just add one thing, and that's the problem. We live in a capitalist society, and all of these news organizations have to have readers who are willing to fork out the money to buy their publications. And we would all love it if everyone read all of our publications, but the reality is that they're still going to buy People magazine so they can read about Kim Kardashian. That's unfortunately a reality. Yes. Yes, sir. Oh.
Victoria Feinberg. I have a question about the elderly, especially those who are bound in the care facilities. We hear very little about their conditions. Recently, NPR talked about the elderly people being drugged with psychotic drugs so they will sleep and wouldn't bother their caretakers. But normally we don't hear much about it, and most importantly, there's very little transparency about what happens to us when we get into that situation.
Is that something anyone can address?
Well, it's, I know the Times has done stories in the past, but I just wrote this down because it's a good idea. I mean, you're right, it's a good, I mean, it's those, the nursing homes are, we've done it in New York, about I can't remember how many years ago now, but a look into this horrible conditions in nursing homes in New York. But it's always something we should be looking at. And I agree with you, I don't think the elderly are covered as much as they should be, given how the population is aging right now.
I think he had a question.
I'm Jeff Bobier, independent investor. Question for you, madam. Has Robert Murdoch adversely affected the quality of the Wall Street Journal? And two,
But I'm with the New York Times.
I understand.
Okay,
I
right.
asked you a tough question.
You want to take that?
And another question is, do you foresee Jeff Bezos having an influence on the editorial comment of the Washington Post?
Well, let's see, I wish somebody from the Post was here. Well, I don't think that, I mean, you can address this better than I. I'm a reader of the Wall Street Journal. I think the Journal has, you know, it moved away a number of years ago from its total focus on economics and now is trying to be more of a general interest paper. Would you agree with me on that or not?
I've been away for a number of years, but as a reader, sure. It's a paper. It's one of the few last papers that has the extraordinary resources to do a lot of things, including on the economics and business side and on some of the general interest side, and that is in no small part due to the fact that it has, you know,
Resources.
large corporate resources.
I mean, I would compete, especially when I was covering the Pentagon, I would compete with the Journal reporters there. They're really good. They're really good. They break a lot of stories. They made my life unhappy. I mean, I thought their journalism at the Pentagon is good, and at the White House as well. And at the Post, I don't know. I mean, I just know what the Post said, people at the Post say, which is they just don't know yet. I mean, I'm talking way out of school. I can tell you he hasn't been in Washington very much, but what they do have right now, which has been very good for the paper, is again, resources. The Post has hired at least 100 people in the last year, and you know, we're going through buyouts right now. So that, now our newsroom is still substantially larger than the newsroom of the Post, but that's quite something that the Post is back in action by hiring people.
But it's, I think, primarily with a focus on digital.
Yes, yes,
And-
yes.
And so that there's different, I think on the editorial page, it hasn't made any difference yet, and everyone's waiting to see what happens.
I think
Yeah.
the Post is committed to try and become more of a national and international paper with more national and international distribution, be more like the Times instead of being so much of a metropolitan paper. Metropolitan dailies in the country are all dying. That's a kiss
true.
of death trying to stay as a metropolitan paper. The Times and the Journal are able to bridge out of that much more better than other newspapers in the country, any other newspaper in the country. And so the Post is trying to go in that direction a little bit. The last thing I did, one of the last things I did at the Wall Street Journal was to invite Rupert Murdoch to come down and visit. This is when he didn't own the paper. And we had a meeting with a bunch of publishers from Latin America in the office of the publisher of the Journal, about a dozen guys. And Murdoch was sitting around all afternoon with his feet up on the table, and he just loved talking about newspapers. And he said at that meeting, you know, if one thing I really would love to do is to buy the Wall Street Journal. The room went silent. The publisher then said it wasn't for sale. So look at it today. I would say the Journal has not suffered at all in quality under Murdoch.
And I would add, if your concern is that there are important stories that are underreported, I would wager that it's in the pages of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times you're most likely to see those stories reported on. I mean, we were talking about just Keystone, for example. There was been a terrific series of articles on the risks that come with transporting crude by rail car in the Journal just a few days ago. And again, this reflects quality, tradition, dedication, and resources that are there thanks to News Corp.
And reporting on stories that aren't necessarily good for business. The Wall Street Journal is not a cheerleader for business.
I actually think there are 3 newspapers that will probably survive this transition in paper. USA Today. And I think the Post actually, you know, I went through that period where there was not a single domestic bureau. They cut New York, they cut LA, and so forth. And I don't think they've expanded. They may have ambitions of being national, but I think carving out that space again or reclaiming it is going to be much harder because people have moved on to other sources of news. But I think the distinct audiences of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and USA Today have their audiences that are all willing that want that kind of news, and that then you're going to get to the B level. And I fear my loyalties to my former employer, but I fear that the Washington Post will end up as kind of a B+ paper. But anyway, let's go on to some of the issues.
I'm Tom Mansbach. I'm a Wilson Center junkie. My question is it underreported or is it not true that the U.S. government has a real problem in deciding whether or not it really wants Assad to fall, having had the experience of Iraq and Libya?
Yeah, that's a good question for you, Robin.
Yeah. This is the conundrum that we don't want Assad to be in power, but we also don't want to go to war with him. And my fear is, having covered 5 years of the Lebanese civil war, which went on for 15 years, that this is a war with Assad that could go on longer, that Syria is Lebanon writ large. And our policy now is based on where we want to reclaim Iraq and kind of push ISIS out back into Syria. In the meantime, be building this new force that then can fight against both ISIS and Assad, and I don't think that's a viable policy. But I think one of the underreported stories, and I meant to mention this, is not just what do you do about Syria, but to tackle the basic question of, does the United States want to fight to keep the borders that were drafted arbitrarily a century ago during the Sykes-Picot Agreement? Do we want to fight to keep them? Or do we want to allow these entities to break down into what may be more natural, viable, whatever, entities? That, especially in this era of globalization, where you see whether it's Yugoslavia or Sudan breaking down into smaller units, and we don't freak as much, or whether it's Scotland breaking away from the voting, actually going to the polls to decide, and it being narrow at that, whether they want to break away because it's okay because they're part of a bigger whole, this whole regionalization thing on the road to globalization. Everybody's part of a regional bloc, be it on economics, security, environment, and so forth. And so the big question is, do we want to fight to save those countries as they are, the territorial integrity, or are we willing? And that's a question we haven't addressed in the same way we haven't addressed Assad. We haven't come to grips with the biggest questions yet. And I personally think that taking on Assad, is a really tough proposition because it could. My fear is we've gotten warlordism that's so bad now. We've seen the Afghanization of Syria to the point that the warlords are redefining the conflict, and they like the status quo. They like the chaos. They're profiting off of it, and that even if the rebels won, pushed back ISIS, got rid of Assad, we face the danger of a civil war that then plays out among the rival factions, that the tensions and passions have only deepened in the last 4 years. So that's why I think Syria is the great unreported story. Back here? In the blue scarf? Yeah.
Thank you. Today we've talked a lot about the US and the Middle East, and I work on Latin American issues, human rights in Latin America, and I'm just wondering if these issues are getting the attention they deserve.
Good question. Edward?
No, is the answer.
Yeah.
I've spent many years covering Latin America, and was just at a panel yesterday with the Council on Foreign Relations on just that very question. And you're right. Latin America goes underreported. It always goes underreported. It's destined to go underreported until the next crisis comes along. That said, there's a lot going on in Latin America, so it could be that it's not so bad that it's underreported for Latin America. What we're especially missing is the Mexican story, which we still see it too much in terms of drugs and violence terms, when so much of the real story is really an economic story, which is a much more positive story about what's happening in Mexico, and the Brazil story about Brazil is an emerging power. I mean, we hear a lot about that. We don't know exactly what it means. and that, in fact, there's more good blood instead of bad blood between the United States and Brazil on so many issues. And as Dilma goes into her second term, just what that's going to mean for not just for Brazil, but for the rest of Latin America, because Brazil is so influential in South America. Our influence is declining in the region, but that's not necessarily bad.
We've run out of time, but I want to go down the panel and ask you, what is the big story of 2015 that may not be obvious today? Something that we should pay attention to, that may break, that may define the next year, that may be different from this year?
I'm terrible. I like to think in big conceptual terms. I mean, I really think it's a decline of nationalism that some people made reference to. I think it's a decline of nation states. I think it's a decline of countries that do not have the gumption to be able to make a decision.
I'm going to just guess and say Pakistan. It's been very quiet there, and it's unnerving how quiet it's been. Maybe I'm watching too much Homeland. Yeah, what? You agree? Yeah. Yeah, it would. I mean, this is that one of the. I just want to say, in the Times newsroom in Washington, we veer. It's, oh my God, it's ISIS, and then another. Oh my God, Ukraine. Oh my God, Ebola. Oh my God, Ferguson. And now, and it's like, and Pakistan was like this crisis about 2 years ago. How long? It's been a while, and it's just gone silent. And bad things are going on. So,
Greg, you can wrap us up.
Well, I'll return to the financial world, the economic world. Next year, the Federal Reserve seems intent on raising interest rates. It'll be the first time it's raised interest rates since 2006. And for a world that's been used to zero interest rates for quite a few years, it could be a very tumultuous event in the financial markets and the economy.
And inflation?
Not going anywhere. It's too low already.
Yay! Thank you all for a wonderful panel. Please join me in thanking them.